A black man in a flawless suit is stopped at the door of Harlem's most famous room. Inside, champagne moves in crystal light. Outside, Harlem stands in streetlight and dust. A single voice makes the decision. A single sentence turns the sidewalk into a courtroom. The club takes black music as a product. The club refuses black bodies as guests. And the man being refused does not argue. He steps back as if he has accepted the verdict. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson walks away without urgency. The doorman stays planted, certain the night will continue as usual. But what did that doorman just set in motion? Harlem, New York, Thursday night, September 19th, 1935. The Cotton Club, a whites-only room built on black sound. A doorman steps into the doorway. He does not ask for a ticket. He does not ask for a name. He looks at a black man dressed like money and authority. And he decides the answer before the question is finished. Where do you think you're going, boy? Silence follows. Not the club's silence. The sidewalk silence. The kind that tells everyone nearby to listen. The doorman keeps going. He says the club is for white patrons only. He says black people belong inside the building only as entertainment. Or as staff. He threatens police. He enjoys the crowd. There are white faces in line behind him. Some amused. Some impatient. Some pleased. They are waiting for a spectacle. They do not get one. The man at the door does not argue. He does not touch the doorman. He does not raise his voice. He looks. He holds the stare long enough for certainty to soften. Then he nods once. He turns away. He walks back into Harlem like nothing has happened. That was the mistake. Because what happened next did not look like revenge. It looked like gravity. It looked like a business losing air. It looked like a machine that kept working, but with more friction every day. The Cotton Club had relied on a simple truth. Black labor made the room run. Black music made the room famous. White money made the room rich. And the door kept the lines clean. Then the door stopped being the most important part. The kitchen started missing its rhythm. Orders came out slower. Small mistakes multiplied. Not enough to call sabotage. Enough to make wealthy patrons notice time. Deliveries began arriving late. Not every delivery. Just enough. Liquor. Food. Linens. The kind of inventory a nightclub cannot improvise. When replacement suppliers showed up, the prices were different. Higher. And the reliability was worse. Then the paperwork started. Health inspectors appeared with questions. Fire inspectors walked through like they owned the building. Licensing officials took their time. No single problem closed the Cotton Club. That was the point. A club can fight a crisis. A club cannot fight a weather system. Inside the room, the biggest draw began to shift. A bandleader demanded more. Not a request. A demand. A raise. Better conditions. Respect. The kind of terms management hated to hear from a black man. A contract was mentioned. So was the idea of breaking it. The threat landed because it was not empty. Other stages existed. Other owners listened. Other rooms were willing to pay. The Cotton Club was no longer the only address in Harlem that mattered. Within weeks, the numbers started to change. Not in the newspapers. In the office. Costs rose. Complaints increased. The room's reputation began to take hits that could not be explained to downtown patrons without telling the truth. And the truth was dangerous. Because the truth made the Cotton Club's policy sound like what it was. A profit model built on exclusion. The owner understood pressure. He had survived pressure. He had caused pressure. He knew the difference between coincidence and design. This was not an accident. This was not anger. It was coordinated. It was patient. It was structured like a ledger. A man like Oni Madden did not panic easily. But he recognized when a business was being surrounded without a gun ever being drawn. He started asking questions. He started hearing a name. He tested whether the problem could be crushed the old way. And he found something he did not like. Harlem was not his territory. Harlem was the territory where messages moved faster than police. Where labor could slow a room without leaving fingerprints. Where suppliers could decide a route was suddenly not worth driving. Where ministers could turn a local insult into a public stain. Where the community could make an establishment feel unwelcome without ever touching the brick. Then a meeting was offered. Not in the street. Not in a nightclub. In an office. With an attorney's voice. A controlled explanation. The kind that makes threats sound like policy. The message was simple. The operational difficulties would continue. They would intensify. They would not stop until the door changed. Not the building. Not the performers. Not the decor. The door. A line was drawn. Either the Cotton Club admits black patrons. Or the Cotton Club bleeds until it cannot justify staying alive. In the middle of October. October 15th, 1935. A statement was issued. A public shift. A promise. a claim that the club would welcome patrons regardless of race. Then came the test. October 18, 1935. Well-dressed black professionals arrived. They did not rush. They did not argue. They walked into the Cotton Club, and the doorman let them through. No incident. No shouting. No headlines. Just a door that had been forced to behave differently. New York noticed. Harlem noticed more. Because everyone understood what it meant when the most famous whites-only room in Harlem could be made to bend without a riot. Without fire. Without blood on the sidewalk. It was a demonstration of power that did not need a speech. And it began with a doorman who thought he was only guarding a policy. Get back to Harlem where you belong. The city heard that sentence 1,000 times. But this time, it landed on the wrong man. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. Harlem, New York. Thursday evening. September 19, 1935. West 142nd Street. The Cotton Club sat in the neighborhood like an imported object. A white-owned room planted in a black district. A door that looked ordinary. A door that worked like a border. Inside, Harlem was a theme. Outside, Harlem was a fact. The men and women walking past the entrance did not need to be told what that door meant. They already knew. In New York, segregation did not always wear a statute. It wore habit. It wore custom. It wore the quiet agreement between police, owners, doormen, and paying customers. The rule was enforced in 100 small moments. A glance, a refusal, a hand held up before a person reached the handle. Sometimes a polite sentence. Sometimes a word meant to shrink a man down in public. Boy, colored, move along. The Cotton Club did not hide what it was. It advertised black music like an attraction. It sold the idea of Harlem to downtown money. It invited white patrons to cross into a black neighborhood at night. And then it protected them from sharing the room with black patrons once they arrived. That was the structure. Black talent in the spotlight. Black labor behind the curtain. White customers in the seats. White management in the office. The contradiction was not an accident. It was the product. The Depression was still squeezing the city. Jobs were not distributed equally. Black workers were pushed into the lowest wages. The most visible work. The easiest work to replace. A waiter. A dishwasher. A coat check man. A musician who could be swapped out if he complained too loudly. Power relied on that vulnerability. Owners understood it. So did the police. So did the men standing in doorways with permission to decide who belonged. A nightclub like the Cotton Club did not survive on tickets alone. It survived on protection, licenses, inspections, the ability to operate without constant interference. Those privileges flowed through political connections, through payoffs, through relationships that were not written down. A white establishment in Harlem could be a profitable machine, as long as it kept the racial order clean, as long as it did not allow the neighborhood to become the audience. That was the fear, not violence, not crime, proximity, the idea of black patrons sitting at nearby tables, the idea of equal space, the idea that the performance was not just for outsiders. Harlem in those years carried two reputations at once. One was culture, jazz, dancing, writers and artists. The Harlem Renaissance had made the neighborhood famous. White newspapers described it like discovery. White visitors described it like adventure. They wanted the sound. They wanted the danger at a safe distance. They wanted to go home afterward. The second reputation was control. Harlem had its own economies, its own underground markets, policy numbers, bootlegging spillover, protection systems, networks that moved money when banks did not, networks that moved favors when institutions refused. White crime groups made fortunes in the city, but even they did not always move freely in Harlem without negotiation. Territory mattered, and race mattered. The neighborhood had a memory for disrespect, and it had an instinct for solidarity when a line was crossed. Still, the public face of authority belonged to white hands. Uniforms, courts, licenses. A doorman at the Cotton Club did not need to be important. He only needed to feel protected. Protected by the owner. Protected by the crowd behind him. Protected by the assumption that the police would take his side if a dispute broke out. That was the mechanism. A man could insult another man because he believed the system would hold, because he believed the consequences would fall in one direction. The person refused would be the one questioned, the one searched, the one pushed off the sidewalk, the one accused of causing trouble. Even when the refusal happened in his own neighborhood, even when the building stood on his street, even when the music came from his community, there was an unwritten law in places like that. Black people could be present, but only in assigned roles. On stage, in the kitchen, on the floor carrying trays, behind the bar, at the door as staff, not as patrons, not as equals. not as buyers of the same luxury being sold with their own culture as the lure. The Cotton Club's brilliance was that it made this arrangement look like entertainment. A good night out, a glamorous room, a band in perfect timing, a crowd laughing as if the city's rules did not apply. But the rules were built into the layout, into the seating, into the way the door was guarded, into the confidence of a man who could block the entrance with his body and say it out loud, because he expected silence to follow. This was not just one club. It was the city's pattern condensed into one doorway, a pattern where white patrons could consume black art while rejecting black presence, a pattern where black excellence was profitable, but black equality was unacceptable, a pattern that turned humiliation into routine, so routine that a doorman could deliver it casually, without fear, without hesitation, without even needing to know the name of the man standing in front of him. And this was the world Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson lived in. He did not arrive at the Cotton Club by accident. He arrived dressed for the room. A navy suit, a crisp white shirt, French cuffs, shoes polished until they caught the streetlight. The outfit was not for vanity. It was a calculation. In Harlem, clothes were a language. At the Cotton Club, clothes were a test. He walked up to the entrance like he belonged there. Not because he believed the rule did not apply, because he wanted to see the rule enforced in full view. He had been invited. A Jewish businessman named Jacob Weinstein, a man with legitimate interests in Harlem, a man who believed privacy could be purchased inside a famous room, a man who believed exceptions existed if the guest carried enough weight. Johnson understood that kind of thinking. He also understood the kind of thinking that ran the door. The doorman did not see Jacob Weinstein's invitation. He did not see any arrangement. He saw skin. He saw a black man too well dressed. And he decided the purpose of the outfit was arrogance. The insult came fast, loud enough for the line to hear. Boy, a word designed to strip status. A word used to keep power simple. The doorman did not recognize him. That was part of the danger. If the doorman had known the name, he might have tried to soften the tone. He might have tried to handle it quietly. But ignorance can be a weapon in a system that supports it. Johnson did not correct him. He did not announce his identity. He did not say the names that could have changed the doorman's posture. He stood still. He looked at the man's face. Not as a person, as a detail, a component. The kind of detail you keep when you are building a response that must last longer than a moment. The sidewalk watched. White patrons in line. Black passers-by on the street. Harlem eyes that knew what the room was. Everyone waiting for the same thing. A reaction. A scene. Noise. That was what the door expected. That was what the crowd expected. That was what police would have expected if they were called. Johnson refused to provide it. He smiled. Not warmth. A controlled expression. The kind that signals memory. The kind that signals a decision has already been made. He held the doorman's gaze. Long enough for the doorman's certainty to shift. A slight hesitation. A small doubt. Then Johnson nodded once. A gesture that could be mistaken for surrender. A gesture that could also be mistaken for agreement. He turned away. He walked. He did not hurry. He did not look back. He did not allow the humiliation to own his posture. That mattered. Because in Harlem, posture is public currency. He walked down West 142nd Street, toward Lenox Avenue, into the neighborhood's usual rhythm. Street corners, shop lights, voices, a city inside a city. He kept moving for time. Time to let the heat drain out of the decision. Time to turn anger into structure. He did not need anyone to tell him what the insult meant. It was not personal. It did not require the doorman to know his name. It was the system speaking through a uniform. A reminder that even in Harlem, white money could build a room that excluded the people outside it. He found himself near the Savoy Ballroom, a black-owned room, a place where Harlem entered without permission. He stood outside and watched. Working people, professionals, families, men in suits, women dressed for the night. They moved through the doors as patrons, not as performers, not as staff, as guests. That contrast did something important. It made the Cotton Club's model visible. The Cotton Club depended on Harlem. It depended on Harlem's location, Harlem's reputation, Harlem's musicians, Harlem's workers, and it returned very little. Just wages, just jobs, and the daily insult of exclusion. Johnson understood leverage. He made money by understanding leverage. He knew what a business needs to keep breathing. Labor, supplies, protection, reputation. A nightclub is not just music and tables. It is a system of inputs, and every input can be pressured. The Cotton Club's owners believed the neighborhood could not coordinate pressure, because coordination requires discipline. It requires organization. It requires influence. It requires people who can make others act in the same direction at the same time. Harlem had those people, but they were rarely in the same room. Not with a shared plan. Not with a single goal. Johnson had the habit of building rooms like that. Rooms where decisions were made quietly. Rooms where different interests aligned because someone had the authority to align them. He went to a payphone, a corner in Harlem, a small box of metal and glass, and he used it like a command post. 3 calls. One to his lawyer, Theodore Green, a man who could translate force into language, a man who could carry threats with legal precision. One to Stephanie St. Clair, the policy queen, a strategist, a woman with networks that reached across Harlem, a woman who understood how pressure moves when it cannot be traced. One to Adam Clayton Powell Sr., a minister, a leader with moral authority, a man who had fought discrimination in public, but who had not always had the machinery to make it expensive. Johnson was not building a gang meeting. He was building a coalition, criminal power, labor influence, community leadership, legitimate voices that could speak in pulpits and newspapers, and the quiet kind of influence that could reach kitchens and supply trucks. By midnight, a backroom filled, a speakeasy on 133rd Street. Men who ran policy operations, union officials, ministers, professionals, doctors and lawyers who had their own stories of being stopped at doors. Johnson stood at the head of the table. He spoke in a quiet voice, the kind that makes people lean in. He described the doorway. He described the words. He did not dramatize it. He did not ask for sympathy. He described the Cotton Club as a machine that extracted wealth from Harlem, a machine that displayed black talent while excluding black customers. And he described what the machine depended on: black labor, Harlem's tolerance, Harlem's silence. Then he told them what would change, not with fire, not with an attack, not with a headline, with pressure applied across multiple points at once. So the owner could not solve it with one phone call. So the owner could not pay off one official and make it stop. So the owner could not fire one worker and restore order. A system, a campaign, a tightening. A room like the Cotton Club was built to hum. He was going to make it grind. And he was going to make the owner choose, change the door, or bleed until the club could not justify staying the same. When the planning ended, Harlem went back to sleep. The Cotton Club kept its lights on. The band kept playing. The white patrons kept arriving. The doorman kept standing at his post. And the city assumed the insult had ended on the sidewalk. It had not. It had just been filed. The next morning, the Cotton Club opened like it always did. The sign stayed up. The door stayed guarded. The music stayed scheduled. No one inside the building knew they had been placed inside a plan. The campaign did not begin with a threat. It began with conversations. Quiet ones. In kitchens. In dressing rooms. In hallways where management did not stand for long. Men were spoken to one at a time. Waiters. Cooks. Porters. Musicians. Each person was told the same thing. Do not quit. Do not fight. Do not give them a reason to call the police. Just slow the machine. The first change was time. Orders took longer. Tables waited. Drinks arrived late. Checks came after a second request. Mistakes happened that looked like accidents. A wrong plate. A missing garnish. A forgotten order. The kind of errors a nightclub can absorb on a good night. Not the kind it can absorb every night. Management complained. Management scolded. But management could not prove intent. Because there was no single act to punish. Only a pattern. A decline. A room losing its precision. Then the supplies started behaving differently. Deliveries were delayed. Trucks showed up incomplete. Invoices arrived with new prices. Higher. A club like the Cotton Club could find alternatives. But alternatives cost more. And they never arrive as smoothly as the old system. Not at first. A manager can scream at a waiter. A manager cannot scream at a broken chain. Especially when the chain runs through Harlem streets. Through Harlem customers. Through Harlem money. The Cotton Club depended on suppliers who wanted access to Harlem's wider market. That was leverage. Not a slogan. A calculation. Lose the Cotton Club. Or lose Harlem. Most suppliers understood math. Then the legitimate pressure appeared. The kind that wears a badge. Inspectors walked in with clipboards. Health. Fire. Licensing. Each visit looked routine. Each visit produced a small expense. A repair. A fine. A recommendation that became a requirement. Nothing that closed the club. That was the point. Closing the club would have created drama. Drama brings sympathy. Drama brings police. Drama creates a story management can sell as persecution. This was not drama. This was overhead. The kind that eats profit without making headlines. By the second week, the Cotton Club's office felt different. A nightclub counts its nights, not its intentions. The math was shifting. More costs. More complaints. More time spent fixing problems instead of selling glamour. And then the pressure reached the stage. The place the Cotton Club could not hide. A major attraction wanted more. Not a favor. More money. Better conditions. Respect in the way management spoke. The demand carried weight because it came with options. Other rooms. Other offers. If the Cotton Club lost its draw, the downtown patrons would not keep coming just for the address. Management tried to hold up paper. A contract. A deadline. An obligation. But contracts are only strong when the environment supports them. And the environment was changing. Inside the building, the staff felt the shift. People talk. They always do. They could sense that the club was being pressured from multiple sides. They could sense that someone was coordinating it. And that coordination gave them courage they did not usually have. Because courage is easier when you believe you are not alone. The owner heard the same reports every day. Late deliveries. Inconsistent service. Inspectors. Demands. Complaints from patrons who paid to be treated like royalty. Only Madden was not naive. He understood pressure. He had applied pressure. He knew the difference between bad luck and design. This was design. He started asking the only question that matters in that position. Who? The answers came back the same way. Not in writing. Not from official channels. From men who spoke carefully. From people who understood Harlem. A name surfaced. Bumpy Johnson. Madden could threaten many people in New York. He could pay for violence. He could pay for protection. He could buy a policeman's patience. But Harlem was different. Harlem had its own loyalties. Its own communications. Its own memory. A white gangster could own a room there. He could profit there. But he could not command the neighborhood the way he could command a dock or a warehouse downtown. When Madden tested the idea of retaliation, he ran into another problem. Retaliation brings attention. Attention brings law enforcement. And law enforcement does not distinguish between the pressure and the response. It sweeps. It raids. It makes examples. A war in Harlem would cost more than the Cotton Club was worth. And it would not solve the problem. Because the problem was not a single man. It was a coalition. That was the new element. Not anger. Not violence. Alignment. Criminal influence. Labor influence. Community influence. Legitimate voices willing to speak publicly. Illegitimate hands willing to make business painful. All in the same direction. Madden received a request for a meeting. Not with Johnson. With an attorney. Theodore Green. The language of the meeting was professional. That was the point. Professional language makes threats sound inevitable. Green explained that the operational difficulties were organized. Green explained they would continue. Green explained they would intensify. And then Green delivered the demand. Open the door to black patrons. And the refusal. Publicly. Madden reacted the way men like him react at first. With contempt. With promises. With the assumption that any problem can be solved by making one person disappear. Green did not argue. Green did not raise his voice. He told Madden what would happen if Johnson was harmed. The pressure would not stop. It would spread. Because the plan was not stored in one head. It had been distributed. That was the shield. Then Green told Madden something that mattered more than a threat. Harlem was not where Madden held power. Harlem was where Madden could lose it. Slowly. Expensively. Without a single dramatic event to fight. Madden negotiated because the alternative was worse. He negotiated because the club's numbers mattered more than his pride. He negotiated because he understood the kind of pressure that cannot be punched. A statement was drafted. October 15, 1935. The Cotton Club announced it would welcome patrons regardless of race. It read like a business decision. Not an apology. A change. A shift in policy. Harlem received the statement with caution. Because Harlem had heard promises before. Promises are cheap. Doors are not. So a test was arranged. October 18, 1935. Well-dressed black professionals arrived. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, people who understood how to behave in a room designed to watch them. They did not arrive as a mob. They arrived as patrons. They walked to the entrance. They faced the door. And they were admitted. No incident. No scene. Just the quiet sound of a rule breaking. Inside, they were seated. They were served. They watched the performance from the audience. Not from the kitchen. Not from the stage. From the seats. That night did not erase Harlem's past. It did not remake New York. But it established a precedent that could be repeated. A door in Harlem had changed because it had become too expensive to stay the same. The Cotton Club kept operating. But it operated under a new reality. Harlem had learned something measurable. Organized pressure could change what sermons could not. It could change what polite requests could not. It could change what courts might take years to touch. And the men who had gathered in that speakeasy back room understood something else. They had built a method, a model, A way to move a powerful institution without touching it directly. They did not call it a movement. They did not name it. They simply applied it. And other doors in Harlem began to feel the same weather. The shock was not that the Cotton Club let black patrons in. The shock was how quietly it happened. A door that had been absolute. A rule treated like physics. Adjusted like a budget line. No riot. No marching. No speeches on the sidewalk. Just a policy that suddenly behaved differently. Harlem understood what that meant. If the Cotton Club could bend, then other doors could bend. Not with pleading. With cost. The men who had helped build the pressure did not celebrate in public. They watched for the reversal. Because a statement is easy to print. A doorman can still refuse people in practice. So the follow-up mattered more than the announcement. For days after the test night, eyes were on that entrance. Harlem sent people who could not be dismissed as trouble. Teachers, clergy, businessmen, women dressed for the room. They arrived in pairs and small groups. They paid. They sat. They left with stories that spread faster than the newspapers. The Cotton Club's management learned a new rule. Every refusal would be noticed. Every insult would be repeated. Every small act at the door could restart the pressure. So they instructed the staff. Do not improvise. Do not argue. Admit them. Serve them. Keep the room calm. This was not enlightenment. It was containment. The club was protecting its revenue. Protecting its licenses. Protecting its ability to operate without a constant drain. Harlem's leaders understood that too. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. did not call it victory in the way a politician would. He used it as proof. Proof that public pressure could gain leverage when it was backed by coordination. When it had economic teeth. When it reached beyond sermons and into payroll and supply lines. Ministers spoke about dignity. But now they could also speak about results. Union officials saw an opportunity. If labor could slow a famous room without a formal strike, then labor had power even when workers were afraid. Black musicians watched closely. Because musicians had always been trapped between two humiliations. Play for white patrons who excluded them. Or lose the biggest stage and the biggest paychecks. Now a third option appeared. Better terms. Better rooms. Competition. If the Cotton Club could not guarantee stability, then loyalty to it stopped being a necessity. That was the deeper shift. Not integration as a moral event. Integration as a market event. Once the Cotton Club had shown vulnerability, other establishments started calculating. They did not wait to be targeted. Some integrated quietly. Some adjusted policies without announcements. They made it look like their decision. They did not want a campaign. They did not want inspectors and suppliers and slow service and musicians with new demands. They wanted peace. And peace had a price. In Harlem, that price had always been paid by black people. Now the price started moving. The coalition that had formed did not stay assembled like a committee. It did not need to. Everyone involved understood the mechanism now. A door was not just a door. It was a point of profit. A point of control. A point of vulnerability. Change the flow of money. Change the flow of labor. Change the flow of supply. And the door becomes negotiable. The method did not require newspapers. It did not require courts. It did not require moral agreement from the people in power. It required only that the people in power love profit more than they loved the rule. That was the weakness in segregation. Not shame. Not conscience. Cost. This is where the story gets more complicated. Because the same operation that forced an opening also demonstrated something else. Harlem's underworld could accomplish what Harlem's legitimate leaders had struggled to force for years. Not because the underworld was righteous. Because it was organized. Because it was disciplined. Because it was willing to apply pressure without needing public credit. And because it could make consequences arrive without warning. That kind of power always leaves a mark. Some in Harlem saw the Cotton Club change as liberation. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent. If criminals could force policy shifts, then criminals could also force other things. Money, votes, silence, access. The same machinery that fought discrimination could also shape the neighborhood's future in ways the neighborhood might not control. Bumpy Johnson did not talk about ideology. He talked about leverage. He had taken a personal insult and turned it into a demonstration. Not of anger. Of capacity. The city heard the surface story. A famous club in Harlem opened its doors. Harlem heard the deeper one. A white-owned institution had been made to obey the neighborhood. Even if only partly. Even if only for business reasons. And in that moment, a new question appeared in the background. If Harlem could do this to the Cotton Club, what else could Harlem do? And who would decide? After the Cotton Club changed its policy, the neighborhood did not suddenly become safe. It became alert. A door had moved. That meant something had pushed it. And in Harlem, People always asked what else could be pushed. The owners of other venues heard the same story. Not the public version, the private version. That the pressure had been organized, that it had been layered, that it had been quiet enough to avoid giving police a clean target, that it had been effective enough to scare a man like Madden into negotiation. Some club managers adjusted before anyone knocked. They stopped enforcing their own informal color lines. They let black patrons sit where they wanted. They called it discretion. They called it avoiding trouble. They did not call it justice. Others resisted. They believed their patrons would protect them. They believed their licenses would protect them. They believed the city would protect them. Then they felt the same pattern. Service losing speed. Supplies becoming unreliable. Inspectors appearing with new questions. Talent asking for better terms. Nothing dramatic. Just a month of nights that did not run the way they used to. A businessman can ignore preaching. A businessman cannot ignore sustained losses. The method spread because it did not require one leader. It required agreement. It required people willing to hold the line. Workers willing to participate without making a confession out of it. Suppliers willing to choose their broader market over a single account. Churches willing to speak about an issue without naming the hand applying the pressure. And it required someone in the background who could make sure hesitation carried consequences. Harlem had always had moral leaders. Harlem had always had political leaders. Now Harlem had a demonstration of coordinated force that sat between both worlds. And that made legitimate men uneasy. Because the same discipline that could force integration could also force silence. The same network that could punish a discriminatory club could punish a rival. The same coalition that could mobilize for dignity could mobilize for profit. People who had been excluded for years understood the opportunity. But they also understood the risk. Once a community learns it can move institutions through economic pressure, it will keep using that pressure. The question becomes who controls it. In the weeks after the Cotton Club's change, Bumpy Johnson did not make speeches. He did not take credit. He did not turn it into a public myth. He let the results speak. That was part of his control. The less visible he was, the harder it was to aim law enforcement at him. The less he claimed, the more the community could claim the outcome as its own. But in private, the message was clear. Harlem could no longer be treated like a stage set. A place for white patrons to visit, consume, and leave unchanged. If a business wanted to operate in Harlem, it would have to respect Harlem. If not out of conscience, then out of self-interest. The doorman at the Cotton Club never appeared in the papers. He did not become a symbol to the city. In Harlem, he became something else. A trigger, a reminder of how casually power had spoken, and how quickly that casual power had learned fear. For older leaders, that lesson carried a warning. If you can force a door open with pressure, you can also force it closed. If you can mobilize suppliers and labor to punish discrimination, you can mobilize them to punish dissent. The neighborhood had gained leverage. But leverage always invites a fight over ownership. The city's institutions did not forget what happened. Police precincts noticed the complaints. Licensing boards noticed the sudden inspections. Downtown political offices heard whispers that Harlem was developing a new kind of discipline. They did not like discipline they did not control. So attention began to shift toward Harlem again. Not admiration. Surveillance. The Cotton Club integration looked like a small policy change to outsiders. To people who understood power, it looked like a rehearsal. A proof that the neighborhood could coordinate across crime, labor, and the church. That is what shocked New York. Not the presence of black patrons in a famous room. The discovery that Harlem could make a white-owned institution obey. And once that discovery exists, it cannot be erased. It sits in the background of every negotiation afterward. Every rent dispute, every labor demand, every political promise. Because now everyone knows what the neighborhood can do when it chooses a target. And everyone knows who can choose the target. Bumpy Johnson walked away from a door without making a scene. Then he made the city understand something it had tried to deny. The door was not the source of power. The people outside it were. And after 1935, Harlem did not forget that. The Cotton Club story became a clean legend in Harlem. A door changes. A policy bends. A neighborhood wins. But the people who live there understood the price. Because victories built on pressure do not end the pressure. They normalize it. They teach everyone watching a new grammar. Not arguments. Not appeals. Leverage. After October, the men who owned businesses in Harlem adjusted their behavior. Not because their beliefs changed. Because their risk changed. They stopped saying never. They started saying maybe. They started asking who needed to be consulted before a decision was enforced. That consultation was the real shift. It wasn't integration as a social breakthrough. It was negotiation as a new operating condition. And negotiation meant Harlem was no longer a passive asset. Harlem was a stakeholder. In private rooms, other owners began doing the math. A discriminatory policy was no longer free. It had a monthly cost, higher labor demands, more supply uncertainty, inspections that did not go away, customers who noticed the slip in quality, and talent that suddenly had options. Some clubs folded quickly. They changed policies without announcements. They let the door become flexible. They told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves it was discretion. Harlem did not care what they called it. Harlem cared that the door opened. Others resisted out of pride. They resisted out of habit. They resisted because their patrons expected the old arrangement. Those clubs learned the same lesson the Cotton Club learned. You can survive one problem. You cannot survive a pattern. A kitchen that works slower every night. A delivery that arrives wrong every week. A bandleader who stops accepting management's tone. A license renewal that takes longer than it should. A fire inspector who wants another exit. None of it ends you. All of it wears you down. And the fear is not the expense. The fear is the fact that it can be increased at will. That is what makes it control. This is where Harlem's legitimate leadership felt a tension. Ministers had preached against discrimination for years. They had held meetings. They had written letters. They had appealed to conscience. Now, suddenly, conscience was not the driver. The driver was consequence. That made the results faster. It also made the mechanism darker. Because the same machinery that punished racism could punish rivalries. The same networks that pressured an owner could pressure a politician. The same discipline that created dignity could also create silence. In Harlem, people did not speak about this openly. They did not need to. They understood. When power proves it can move a door, it also proves it can close one. And anyone who benefits from power will eventually try to own it. Bumpy Johnson's role in the story stayed mostly unspoken outside the neighborhood. That was useful to him. A public hero becomes a public target. A public target draws federal attention. A public target invites surveillance that chokes business. So he let other voices carry the public tone. The attorney spoke in offices. The minister spoke in pulpits. Union men spoke in meetings. Johnson stayed behind the line. He was the hand that did not wave. But Harlem knew. Harlem knew the difference between a polite request and a decision backed by enforcement. And so did the city. Because New York's power structure could accept integration. What it could not accept was the idea that Harlem could impose terms. That was the shock. Not black patrons sitting in a famous room. The fact that a white-owned institution in Harlem had been made to obey Harlem. That fact carried consequences the city did not want to explore. Police precincts began paying closer attention. Licensing boards tightened their grip. Political offices listened harder for names. And the underworld listened too. Because the Cotton Club lesson was a tool. And tools attract men who want to use them for different purposes. By the end of that season, Harlem had learned something durable. Segregation could be fought with economics, with organization, with patience, not with a single dramatic night. And the city had learned something else. Harlem was not just a place to extract culture from. Harlem could organize. Harlem could coordinate. Harlem could punish. That is what remained after the music ended. A neighborhood that had discovered its own leverage. And a man who had demonstrated, without raising his voice, that leverage could be weaponized. The door had changed, but the balance beneath it had changed more. And everyone could feel that the next target would not be decided by accident. The Cotton Club did not become a different place overnight. It stayed what it had always been. A white-owned room. A Harlem address. A business that sold black music to white money. The difference was the door. A door that had once spoken with certainty. Now it spoke with caution. Harlem did not mistake that caution for respect. Harlem understood it as a new kind of fear. The kind that comes when a system learns it can be disrupted without a single clean act of violence. The kind that comes when power realizes it has dependencies. The neighborhood's musicians noticed first. Because they had lived inside the contradiction. They had built the Cotton Club's reputation with sound. They had watched white patrons applaud from seats they could not sit in. Now, when they negotiated, they did it with a new confidence. Not moral confidence. Market confidence. They had options. They had leverage. The workers noticed too. Waiters, cooks, porters, people who had always been told they were replaceable. They had just participated in something that proved the opposite. Not through a strike. Not through public defiance. Through coordinated discipline. Harlem's churches noticed in a different way. Ministers had always been asked to produce hope. Now they could also point to consequence. They could tell their congregations that dignity was not only a sermon topic. It could be enforced. But enforcement always leaves residue. Once a community proves it can organize pressure, it cannot pretend it doesn't have that tool. And once a tool exists, others reach for it. To open doors. To close doors. To punish discrimination. To punish competition. To move policy. To move money. The Cotton Club was a demonstration. Not just of what Harlem could do to a club, of what Harlem could do to any institution that depended on Harlem while refusing Harlem. That lesson did not stay inside nightlife. It seeped into landlords, into merchants, into political promises, because the city's order was built on an assumption that Harlem could be managed, that Harlem could be extracted from, that Harlem could be visited, that Harlem could be spoken to from behind a protected door. After October 1935, that assumption carried doubt. Not enough to make the city confess it. Enough to make the city watch more closely. Inspectors became more active. Police became more interested. Licensing agencies became less casual. It was not a crackdown with a name. It was pressure in the other direction. A reminder that the city could also apply friction. Harlem felt that, too. And the men who had built the Cotton Club campaign understood the new landscape. They had won a policy change. But they had also triggered attention. That is the trade. A successful display of power always invites a counter-display. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than most. He had not taken a bow. He had not demanded a headline. He had done the opposite. He had let the results spread without his voice attached to it. That was how he stayed untouchable. A legend without a signature. A rumor that could not be pinned to a single act. But Harlem knew where the idea had started. With a man turned away in his own neighborhood. With a doorman who believed the system would hold. With a quiet walk-away that looked like surrender to outsiders. And looked like discipline to anyone who understood power. The Cotton Club door opened. New York called it a change. Harlem called it a warning. Because the warning was not aimed at patrons. It was aimed at owners. If you build your fortune in Harlem, you will answer to Harlem. Even if the city pretends otherwise. And once that truth exists, it does not disappear. It waits. In every doorway. In every contract. In every quiet refusal that someone decides to remember.